Thank you for joining me for another video here on my channel. I've talked about feed ingredients from soy, and I covered quite a number of them. And then I released another video about soybean meal, and I've released a video about full-fat soybean meal. But in each case, it's difficult to talk about the ingredient itself and talk about how to use the ingredient in aquafeeds because the videos are just too long. So I'm splitting this up. In this video, I'm going to be talking about feeding full-fat soybean meal to fish. So here we go. Before I get into specific details about feeding full-fat soybean to fish, I just wanted to remind you of some of the core characteristics of these ingredients, just in case you have not watched those other videos in sequence, and perhaps you have not had a refresher about this in some time. So in this first table, which is coming from this book that I mentioned in the other two videos about the quality control methods for soy, we have this table, and it's showing us raw soybean seeds, full-fat soybean meal, normal soybean meal, fermented soybean meal, and then we have soy protein concentrate, treated by enzymes. So this would be typically around, as you can see, 55 to 60% protein. And we have alcohol extracted soy protein concentrate, which has a higher protein, typically above 63. Then we look at the next slide. These next few slides are coming from the website of the Department of Poultry Science at the University of Georgia. There you can scan the QR code and you can go and see this information there and look in more detail. So the first of these tables identify that this information is coming from the 2003-2004 Feedstuffs Ingredient Analysis Table. So Feedstuffs is an industry trade newspaper, which is sold by subscription. It comes out on a weekly basis, talks a lot about all different kinds of things related to animal feed production. Even though this looks like it could be a little bit old, other than the fact that modern agriculture might have changed some of their varieties of plants that they're growing, all of the other conditions more or less remain the same, and we can assume that, the latest data would not look much different than this. So the main thing we see here then is that comparing our full-fat soy to expeller soy to solvent-extracted soybean meal with hull and without hull is the fat content. And so the real benefit of full-fat soy, whether it's extruded or roasted or whatever, is the presence of this fat. Looking now at amino acid concentration and availability, there you see the products compared once again, and in this case they're being reported on a percent of ingredient as is basis. Vitamins, we see there that there's vitamin E and thiamine and riboflavin, pantothenic acid, folic acid, and choline are basically, and also niacin, are reported as being identical for each one of those uh, two kinds that I've highlighted there with the green arrows, the full fat cooked and the soybean expeller. The only one where we see a difference then here is in the biotin, and the biotin here is reported as being 320 micrograms, and the soybean meal is reported as being 32. Now, biotin is a vitamin which actually is quite stable against most processing methods and feed production methods. And so any biotin that you might have there, scientists have shown, can pretty much end up in your finished feed. However, with most of these other vitamins, some of them are not very stable during our aggressive feed production processes, and nutritionists and formulators basically assume that the vitamins are not coming at all from ingredients. And if they were, we would have no ability to judge whether they're coming in at consistent levels or not. So we typically would say that, assume that the feed ingredients are not providing any vitamins at all. We would be adding in our full vitamin mix in order to provide all of the vitamins needed to meet the requirements of our species. Here we are with minerals. So we have the macro minerals in percent: sodium, potassium, chloride, magnesium, and sulfur. And then we have the trace minerals: manganese, iron, copper, zinc, and selenium. To summarize, we could say that full-fat soybean meal provides the same quality of nutrients as soybean meal in a high-fat package. It remains kind of a niche high-protein product for aquafeed because in feeds that don't really need a high fat content, then an ingredient like this maybe actually brings in too much fat and inadequate protein. The balance isn't quite right. We would prefer to use a high protein, low fat ingredient like expeller or defatted, dehulled soybean meal. In looking here in this table, and once again, there's a QR code, you can scan it and go and find it. The high fat content is really the only thing that makes the full fat soybean meal a decision based on the kind of feed that you're trying to make. And what's the differences? Well, here we see that it really gives us a lot of PUFA, so polyunsaturated fatty acids here. And that mainly consists of C18-2 or linoleic acid and C18-3 omega-3, which is the linolenic acid. And there's the data across soybean oil, soybean cake, and full-fat soybean meal. Here's a comparison between a couple of fish oils. We have in this column menhaden oil, and we have pollock oil, and we have soybean oil. We have palmitic acid 16-0. It's found quite substantial quantities, nearly 15 to 17% showing here, as opposed to about 11 in soy. So soy does provide that. That's a good energy source in a medium chain fatty acid. And then when we get down here, we see really the very big difference. So in the case of the linoleic and the linolenic, in both cases, uh, they are under 1% in the fish oils, and also under 1% in the soybean oil. But when we're looking at the linoleic acid, is a composition more than 50% of all of the soybean oil. Whereas going down here, we see that the EPA and the DHA, we do have certain quantities. Now, depending on the source of fish oil, some fish oils might have more EPA than DHA. Other oils like tuna oil have more DHA than EPA. The real thing is, though, is whenever we include soy in our diets, we have to compensate for their total lack of these long chain polyunsaturated fatty acids. When we're looking at the lipid content and also the profile of the full-fat soybean meal, while many animals can use the palmitic acid and oleic acid as sources of energy, they can also use linoleic acid and linolenic acid as starting points for production of arachidonic acid, EPA, and DHA via elongation and desaturation pathways. But in most cases, the juvenile fish are growing so fast that I don't rely on this native production, endogenous production. I would prefer to put some into the feed. Now, that high fat content of the full fat soy can sometimes cause problem with pellet expansion, especially with single screw extruders. So it's an ingredient that if we were making a floating feed for fish, such as a tilapia feed or a carp feed or maybe even a catfish feed, if we're going to be using full fat soy, the total amount we can use actually is going to be quite low. My rule of thumb is that if the endogenous fat coming from all dry ingredients, whether it's coming from fish, animal, or vegetable, totals less than 5.5% of the weight, so that would be equivalent to 55 kilograms of fat per metric ton in the feed formulation, pellet expansion with a single screw extruder will not be a problem, and oil content is not an issue with twin screw extruders. Now, if for some reason you really wanted to use full-fat soybean meal, well, then the thing is it gives you a lot of fat in a relatively compact package. Then you're going to have to reduce your oils coming from other ingredients. Finally, since high temperature extrusion also destroys most of the vitamin E, the high fat level of polyunsaturated fatty acids in full-fat soybean meal can often lead to rapid oxidation and rancidity because there's no antioxidants to stop the rancidity from progressing. And this may affect feed taste and palatability and reduce feed intake with sensitive species. And I mentioned in the video where I was just talking about full-fat soybean meal that it's an ingredient that I would like to have coming in very often, and I would not store it in a tropical climate like Thailand here. I would not like to store it more than about 2 weeks. And I would simply buy a little and have another delivery rather than keeping it in the warehouse too long. Okay, feeding full-fat soybean meal to fish. Feeding full-fat soybean meal to carp. We have two papers. This one is from Germany, then we have from Egypt, and we have this one from Korea. You can see the authors and the dates. It's all dealing with common carp. This tells us the body weight. So they started out at 22 grams and grew them to 100. So that's about a 5-fold increase. This one, they grew from 9 to 13. So that one, the fish are actually fairly small. And I would say probably this experiment was a bit short. But 56 days, I would like to see that at least 18, let's say. And in this one, they're dealing with 111 grams, and they grew them up to about 200 grams, 28 days, probably also a bit on the short side. We see the fish The first slide here is feeding full-fat soybean meal to carp. So I'm just highlighting for you 3 different papers that I found. Abel et al. From Germany, Taleb et al. From Egypt, and then Kim et al. From South Korea. All dealing with common carp. The body weight there and the final weight, that's a 5-fold increase. This is less than a doubling of the weight. That's really not enough to really show anything. And then this one is basically a doubling of the weight, so that's okay. But this one is probably too short, and I'd like to see this one done for maybe a couple of months rather than just 1 month. We see the amount of full-fat soybean meal. In this case, the control had 0 and they had 50. And then they had lysine or not, and methionine or not. You see here they had none added. And then what are they replacing? They're replacing fish meal, extracted soybean meal, and also fish meal. The amount of fish meal that was in the formula, so they had reduction from 62 in the feed with 0 full-fat soy, and in the feed that had 50% full-fat soy, they reduced the fish meal to 31%. So they still had a lot of fish meal in there. And here's what they were testing. And then my conclusion after reading the paper, this would have worked better if they supplemented lysine and methionine. Among the different ways that they cooked the soy, the autoclaving for 30 minutes seemed to be better than less or longer time than that. And in this case of this paper with Kim, they tested full-fat soy at 0, 13, 27, 40, and 56% of the formula. And in the higher soy levels, there was 0 fish meal. Their recommendation was less than 25%. Once they went above that, they saw a significant reduction in growth and feed performance. This is the QR codes. You can go and scan those papers. They're all available to download for free. I'm going to focus now on one of these papers, this third one that I showed you from Kim from Korea. And let's just simply go down here and look. And down here it says the present results indicated that as dietary full-fat soy levels increased, growth performance and feed utilization decreased, while excretion of protein and phosphorus increased. Therefore, it was concluded that more than 25% substitution by full-fat soy for fish meal could exert negative effects on growth and feed utilization of carp. Okay. And this was a second paper that I didn't show you there. So this one's looking at effects of dietary full-fat soybean levels on growth performance and feed utilization and phosphorus excretion of carp. And here we can see the different treatments. So we have, looking down, so let's look at their results in a little more detail. So we have then the index up here. We see fish meal 24%, soy 13, fish meal 16, soy 27, up to fish meal 0 and soy 56. Initial weights of the fish all around 111 grams. And then we see the weight gain. Now, if we look at the feed intake goes down and significantly lower once we get to 40% soy. So this could be a palatability issue. It could be a fiber issue. It's a little bit hard to say. And then if we look at the protein intake, we see since the feed intake went down, the FCR went up, then the protein efficiency ratio went down as well. Looking at the protein excretion, so here they're interested in water quality. When they use full-fat soybean meal as an ingredient, does it make water quality worse? And they're looking at two things. They're looking at excretion. they're looking at two things. One is excretion of protein, which basically means nitrogen pollution to the water. And then they're looking at phosphorus excretion, which is basically reducing phosphorus waste to the water, which leads to eutrophication. And they're doing this actually based on retention in the whole body, and then they're basically assuming that what wasn't absorbed in the body was lost. And here you have the same diets as before, and then we have the amount of nitrogen excreted. So the worst one seems to be that once we got above 40%, you may recall that the FCR went up and the protein efficiency went down. At that point, then the excretion increased quite considerably. And then looking at phosphorus, in this case, the excretion was not significantly different, except that this one here was on this slide. Basically, the authors are concerned about uneaten nutrients in the feed. So how much protein, or in other words, nitrogen, is being excreted into the water, which of course is a major factor in reduction of water quality. And then also excretion of phosphorus, which leads to eutrophication. In both cases, then, first top table is protein, the bottom one is phosphorus. We have the different diets as noted in previous slides. As the amount of soy goes up, naturally the amount of phosphorus that is eaten goes up, and the amount of protein intake in the feed In this slide, they're focusing now on these two tables. One is protein excretion based on retained protein in the whole body of the carp. So they're trying to estimate the amount of protein that was excreted in the feces as a way to assess nitrogen loss. And of course, in the case of nitrogen loss, they're worrying about reduction of water quality from the farm. And then in the lower table, then they're doing for phosphorus the same. So we see the same codes for the diets as previous. And here we'll just focus looking at the excreted. So at the soy of 40%, then the amount excreted increases significantly. And so above that, then you get significant protein excretion, and that would want to be avoided. So you may recall that these authors said that they didn't recommend using more than 25%, and that's partly because 25% is cut off more or less at about this point here. Looking at phosphorus excretion, we see that in the high fish meal, lowest soy level, the amount of phosphorus they estimated was excreted was high. This may in fact be a combination of bone in the fish meal, which the phosphorus is in the form of hydroxyapatite or tricalcium phosphate, and so that would be not available. And then here at the highest level, we then see also a lot of phosphorus. Now, this is going to be because of the presence of phytic acid. And then the excretion in terms of kilograms of grams of phosphorus excreted per kilogram of feed intake. And so here they're giving us the lowest value is coming from 40% soy, but they recommended at this level here, if you call, about 25%. First up is looking at full-fat soybean meal fed to carp. And here I'm talking about 4 different studies. The first one by Viola et al. In 1983. These are researchers located at the Technion, the university in Haifa, Israel. And then we have Abel et al. This is from Germany. Taleb et al. This is from Egypt. And then we have finally actually 2 papers by Kim et al. And here in this list, I'm only showing you one, but I will be discussing both of them. So looking at this information, everybody is using common carp. So there's no Asian carps, there's no Indian carps, nothing is available about any of those, at least according to what I'm able to find up to basically the end of 2025. So in terms of Viola, they did a preliminary study with aquarium and they're growing fish from 40 to 50 grams, quite a limited experiment, but it was to help them to understand what more they needed to do. And then they conducted one cage trial with full-fat soybean meal. So in this case, in 28 days, they grew the fish from 170 grams to about 260 grams. And what they were doing was they were using full-fat soy to replace soybean meal. Now, they talk here about the fact that the diet that contained full-fat soybean meal was the equivalent of a 35% soybean meal diet plus 5% soybean oil, as here. They actually do not tell us how much full-fat soybean meal was in the research diet itself. They didn't give us that information at all. The diets that they were using, nevertheless, had 5% fish meal. They did not add any lysine. They added a small amount of methionine. Very limited testing, only weight gain was of interest to them. And their conclusion was that well-heated full-fat soybean meal, because they tested it with different degrees of heating, was not different than properly heated soybean meal plus oil. So they found that they could be substituted. Of course, if you're feeding a full-fat soy with a lower protein content, then the formulation actually will have more full-fat soy if you're trying to do it on an equivalent soy protein basis. But we never found that out from their paper. The second one here is then by Abel. So they took 22.6 gram carp, raised them to about 100 grams. So that's about a 5-fold increase over the period of 85 days. They had a controlled diet with 0 full-fat soy and another diet with 50. So they basically, there's no levels in between. It's just simply 0 or 50. They're replacing fish meal. So the zero soy diet had 62% fish meal, which is high, but maybe not so bad for the 1980s. That was quite a typical level. And then in the diet that had 50% full-fat soy, they still had 31% fish meal, which today would be considered to be still very high by today's standards. No added lysine, no added methionine, and they're looking at weight gain, feed intake, and feed conversion ratio. And their conclusion was that full-fat soy would work fine at that level as long as there were supplemental lysine and methionine needed to balance it against maybe a fish meal diet, something like that. The next study we have from Egypt. So this one, the fish are grown only from 9 grams to 13 grams. So I don't really consider this to be decent because the weight gain is too small. It needs to be multiples of triple, quadruple, or maybe 5 times. Only a small gain here, not even double, is not really very useful to us. 56 days, it seems like the fish were probably growing pretty slow. So then we have to question their experimental equipment, their laboratory setup, their design, and so on. Anyway, they were replacing solvent-extracted soybean meal, and they had a diet with a 28% full-fat soy. The diet still contained 20% fish meal. Now, for carp, this is really, really very high. Today, I don't think anybody's making carp diets for fingerling to grow out size of more than 10%. In many cases, maybe only 5% fish meal. So then they're looking at weight gain, feed intake, feed conversion ratio, and protein efficiency ratio. And they were looking at the different types of soy preparation, and they concluded that the soy autoclave for 30 minutes rather than less or rather than longer was the best that in according to their estimation. And then finally we have this study with carp 111 grams grown to 200. Once again, that's really not enough. But the experiment was quite short, only about 1 month. And they used full-fat soy at 5 different levels, 0, 13, 27, 40, and 56%, replacing fish meal. The control diet had 32% fish meal. The diet with 56% full-fat soy had 0 fish meal. And I will talk about this in more detail in a minute. So they added some lysine and they added some methionine, and their conclusion was less than 25% full-fat soy was acceptable for common carp. Now, if you want to read any of those papers, here's the QR codes, and you can go and find them here. I want to spend a few minutes now to talk about this study by Kim. So, effects of dietary full-fat soybean levels on growth performance and feed utilization and phosphorus excretion of carp. So, they're particularly interested in the using the full-fat soy in a diet, and from an environmental perspective, they want to maximize protein uptake, minimize protein loss or nitrogen excretion, and they want to maximize phosphorus uptake and minimize phosphorus excretion. So they said here in their summary that the present results indicated that as dietary full-fat soy levels increased, growth performance and feed utilization decreased, while excretion of protein and phosphorus increased. Therefore, it was concluded that more than 25% substitution by full-fat soybean meal for fish meal could exert negative effects on growth and feed utilization of carp. So here we are. Let's look at their table. First of all, we note here that this means that the diet contained 24% fish meal and 13% full-fat soy. And this one had 0% fish meal and 50% 6% full fat soy. So that's their designation for their treatments. And then if we look at the weight gain, we see control 0 full fat soy had by far the best growth. Adding any soy at all gave you a significantly lower uh, growth performance. And when we get up here to 40% or 56%, then the growth is significantly poorer. And if you're looking at that 39 versus 91, it's basically less than 50% of the weight gain of the 0 soy control. And then they mentioned DGI. Well, DGI is actually just that's daily growth um, index, and that's basically what we know here as ADG, or average daily gain. So once again, as we saw the slow growth, we also note that 3.79 grams gain per day for the control versus only 1.8 grams gain per day, so less than half the growth rate. So we have feed intake there, and we have feed conversion ratio. The feed conversion for the high soy was considerably poorer. This is actually pretty respectable for carp, and this is not so bad at all. But notice that these still are significantly worse. This has an A sub A superscript, and this is already a C and a C, and so you can see right there. And then down at the bottom, we have the protein efficiency ratio. So once again, in every parameter here, they basically see at the highest full fat soy near about half the result of the 0 full fat soy control. Now, I mentioned that they're interested in looking at the effects of feeding full fat soy to carp from the perspective of water quality, pollution, and so on. And here in the top, they're looking at protein excretion based on retained protein in the whole body of the carp. And then they're assuming that if it's not retained, it's excreted. Well, there's a little bit of math going on there. But looking here, we see that they fed 467. They estimated only 171 was retained. 296 was excreted. And then they have the phosphorus or the protein excretion per kilogram of feed. So they're implying about 20% of the protein, 250 grams per kilogram, was not absorbed. Likewise, looking here at the phosphorus. Okay, well, I went through the paper and I found this. So here's the phosphorus level that they declare for the feed based on the proximate analysis. So control 1.46 and with the full fat soy from 1.5 down to 1.33. When I see a number decreasing like that, as the soy is increasing and the phosphorus is not increasing, it's decreasing, then that suggests to me that some of that phosphorus actually is coming from bone in the fish meal. And the bone in fish meal is not something that I particularly like because it's tricalcium phosphate, which is largely poorly digestible compared with other forms of phosphate like monocalcium phosphate or dicalcium phosphate. As we look then across at the phosphorus excretion, so they fed them 18 grams per kilogram of weight gain and excreted about half of it. And then they're calculating that it excreted about 7 grams per kilogram of feed intake. Now, this is a second paper by Kim, more or less the same group of researchers. And in this case, now what they're doing is they're looking at different levels of soy, but they're looking now at the impact on apparent digestibility of the nutrients. So here in the red box, I say, I've highlighted the fact, and I'll just read this. Fish were fed 5 diets, control, as before, containing both 32, 24, 16, 8, and 0% fish meal, as before. And then they basically say that the apparent digestibility coefficients of ash, calcium, and phosphorus in diets significantly increased with the increase of dietary full-fat soybean meal, suggesting the high availability of phosphorus in monocalcium phosphate. Okay, well, let's go and have a little bit of a look at that. And then you see up above there, they say apparent digestibility coefficients of dry matter, protein, lipid, total carbohydrates, and energy in diets showed a reduction that was significant to 0.005, 0.05. And then above, they're talking about apparent digestibility coefficients. This is a second paper by Kim et al., and in this case, they're looking at the same diets that they used in the previously mentioned experiment, but in this case, they're actually looking at the apparent nutrient digestibility in those diets. And in the red box there, I've highlighted the diets just reminding you of those. And then below they say that the apparent digestibility coefficients of dry matter, protein, lipid, total carbohydrates, and energy in diets showed a reduction significant at 0.05. With the increase of dietary full-fat soybean level, although there was no difference in the ADCs between control and the diet with 24% fish meal and 13% soy. In other words, the diet that contained the lowest amount of full-fat soybean meal. And the apparent digestibility coefficients of ash, calcium, and phosphorus in the diet significantly increased with the increase of dietary full-fat soybean meal, suggesting the high availability of phosphorus in monocalcium phosphate. So I haven't described the diets, I haven't shown you that information, but if you go back and look at either one of these papers, you can look more closely, you can get the information about the supplementation of phosphorus in the feeds. This is a second paper by the same authors, and they're using the same diets as they were in the previous experiment. But in this case, what they're looking at is the impact of adding more full-fat soy on the apparent nutrient digestibility of dry matter, protein, fat, and so on. So here we have the diets, and you can see the degree of fish meal and the full-fat soy. So they have wheat flour, which they're adjusting according to balance the diet weight. Fish oil is going down as they add more fat from the full-fat soy. Then they have single-cell protein, consistent, and they have some corn gluten meal in there, and monocalcium phosphate. And then if you go down here to the bottom, you see they have choline, methionine, lysine added, as I noted in the table I showed you earlier. And then down here, we have the declared quantity of phosphorus in the feeds. Here's the apparent digestibility coefficients of these diets. So this is not the ingredients, this is the diets. And we see that the protein digestibility of the control all fish meal and no soy, 87%, and 86%. So these are not, these two are not different. So soy at the lowest level is not different than the control. But as they take the soy above 13% and they go to 27%, which is actually quite a big gap, then there is a significant reduction in protein digestibility, which just gets worse as they increase the amount of soy. Now, whether that's due to phytic acid, well, we don't know that, but we have to assume that the digestibility of the protein itself is not going to differ very much. There will be some interaction, but we have to think about external factors like phytic acid, which they're not talking at all about here. And then we see the lipid also going down. So then we have here calcium, phosphorus, and energy. Curiously, they're showing that the phosphorus digestibility of the control is very low. And as they added more soy, the availability of phosphorus increased. Let's look a little bit more in detail. So they summarize here apparent digestibility coefficients of dry matter, protein, lipid, total carbohydrates, and energy in diet showed a reduction significant at 0.05 with the increase of dietary full fat soybean level, although there was no difference in the apparent digestibility between control and the fish meal 24 soy 13, or in other words, that was the lowest level of full fat soy. And then they note that the apparent digestibility coefficients of ash, calcium, and phosphorus in the diet significantly increased with higher levels of full-fat soybean meal, suggesting the high availability of phosphorus in monocalcium phosphate. Well, that doesn't make much sense to me because there was no monocalcium phosphate in their diets. And so that seems to be there's something wrong with that statement. Moving now on to full-fat soybean meal for tilapia. I'm highlighting 4 studies here. Note that 3 of these studies are Goda Abdelwarith has 2 here. Those are all coming from Egypt, which leads in research into the nutritional requirements of tilapia above all other country research worldwide. And then at the bottom, we have one paper by Bell and Davies coming from the United Kingdom. In this first study, they tested 2 kinds of tilapia. So Nile tilapia is NT, which you see here. And then they also tested another one, tilapia Galilee, which is Galilee is Lake Galilee in Israel. So they're talking about, they tested with the Nile tilapia, starting weight 32 grams. They grew them to 300. The other species of tilapia here, 31 grams, and they grew them to 165 on 119 days. They were testing soybean meal at full-fat soy at 47% to replace full-fat, normal soybean meal and also fish meal. And so there you see they were testing for weight gain, instantaneous growth rate, FCR, protein, moving on now to feeding full-fat soy to tilapia. I've got 4 experiments highlighted here. The first 3 are coming from Egypt, which does more research into tilapia nutrition than any other country worldwide. And then we have one paper here coming from the United Kingdom. The first paper by Goda was testing 2 species of tilapia. So you have Nile tilapia and you have tilapia Galilee. Now, Galilee is basically the Lake Galilee in the state of Israel. And so they tested these, both the Nile tilapia, 32 grams starting weight to 300 grams, and the Galilei 31 grams to 165 grams. So a slower growth rate for the smaller tilapia. And the feeding trial was quite long, 119 days. They were testing full-fat soy at 47% inclusion rate, using it to replace both fish meal and also soybean meal. And there you can see they added some lysine and methionine, and then they were looking at those test metrics. Now, they do not, because they're only using one level, they can't really say what was the optimum, because in the end they kind of said that whether they had fish meal or not, they didn't see much of a difference. Looking at the two studies there by Abdul Warith, both of them were with full-fat soy in one trial. Let's look at the top one here. So the starting weight was 22.6 grams, and full-fat soy 85, and fish meal 113 grams. So they're testing these fish, but they have different finishing weights. So they started at 22 grams with full-fat soy to 85, and 22 grams to the fish meal diet. They did 113 grams. So obviously better growth on the fish meal. Feeding trial, 84 days. They were testing 0 to 57% soy, full-fat soy. So that's quite a high rate. And then you can see the control had 43% fish meal. They reduced it to 23 to 16. And then they had 16 plus methionine. So this methionine is only responding to the 16% fish meal with methionine. There's the results. And they're reporting poor growth at any full-fat soybean meal level. In the those two experiments, they're not that much different, although you can go and compare those experiments. They're quite a few years apart. And then finally, we have this paper from the United Kingdom. The tilapia they started with are quite small, 3.1 grams. They grew them to 15 grams with the control. That is the high fish meal diet. And then when they were the diet with 48% full-fat soy, then they had poor growth, only 10.7 versus 15 for the control. And they mentioned here poor growth with soybean meal, full-fat soybean meal, and corn gluten meal. So these people were really interested in a high fish meal diet that gave them the best result. If you want to find those papers and read any of them, there are the QR codes. I will highlight a little bit here from the first paper that was in my table by Goda. Growth performance and feed utilization of Nile tilapia and tilapia Galilei. Fed plant-based protein diets. So here we see, if we look at the legend, we have a fish meal diet, which is the small dots. Then we have a soybean meal diet, a full-fat soybean meal diet, which is the triangles. And then the last one we have is a corn gluten meal diet. And as we would expect, in this case, they're based on what they reported, the fish meal diet grew the best, and the diet with the corn gluten meal performed the poorest here. But I haven't gone into the detail because I'm really focusing on the soy. And then if we look at the, I say it's tilapia Galilei, but actually it's Cerotherodon. So here we see something similar that we actually, in this case, it's very curious that the soybean meal diet actually outperformed the fish meal diet. So that's the soybean up there, and the fish meal is here. And then whether we're talking about the full-fat soy or the corn gluten meal, there really was not much different. noting here that with this species, they had a slightly poorest performance was coming from the full-fat soy. Now, if we compare the specific growth rate, so this is daily gain on a percent body weight basis, we can see the comparison between these two species. So in terms of fish meal level, soybean level, full-fat soy, or on the corn gluten diet, that in most cases, the Nile tilapia outperformed. So that would be our preferred aquaculture species. Goda actually has done quite a lot of research with tilapia in Egypt, which I reported in other videos. He's done work with DDGS, and so on. This paper, Apparent Protein Digestibility and Amino Acid Availabilities of Dietary Fish Meal, Soybean Meal, and Full-Fat Soybean Meal in Nile Tilapia Fingerlings. Here we're showing you the 3 diets or composition. So here's another paper by Goda, Apparent Protein Digestibility and Amino Acid Availabilities of Dietary Fish Meal, Soybean Meal, and Full-Fat Soybean in the Nile Tilapia. Goda has actually done quite a lot of nutrition research with tilapia, and if you've watched my DDGS and corn fermented protein video, he's also done work with many other ingredients, corn gluten meal, etc., other than just soy. Here we see in the first table on the left-hand side the nutritional profile of each of these ingredients. So the fish meal at 70% crude protein, the soybean meal at 44% protein, and the full-fat soy at 38. The fat level of the soy is only 1.86, but of the full-fat soy is 18, which is quite a normal level. Now, looking then at the experimental results, here's another paper by Goda. I might mention that Goda is actually quite a prolific researcher into the nutrient requirements and ingredients in feeds for tilapia from Egypt. You may recall if you saw the DDGS and corn fermented protein video that he has done research into other ingredients, also things like corn gluten meal. But in this case, he's looking at the apparent protein digestibility and amino acid availabilities of dietary fish meal, soybean meal, and full-fat soybean meal in the diets for Nile tilapia fingerlings. His Nile tilapia were 18.7 grams, 30 fish per treatment, and he used chromic oxide as his marker. And then after acclimation to diets, fish were used in groups of 5 to 10 feces collection intervals over consecutive days. So actually, then he basically ended up with 100 different lots of feces because he had 10 feces collection intervals over 10 days. So that was in order to get the quantity that he needed. In the left-hand table, we see the nutritional profile of the ingredients. In the center here, we see the nutritional profile of the diet. So he has 5 diets. So fish meal, and then soy at 50 and 75% of fish meal replacement. And then we have full-fat soybean meal at 50 and 75% of fish meal protein replacement. So you see the diets here, fish meal, 27 and so on. And then in those 2 diets, you see the soy there, and these 2, you see the full-fat soy. Other ingredient, basically only wheat bran and a little bit of oil. But in the full-fat soybean meal, they did not add the oil because it already has quite a high fat level. And then if we look over here on the right-hand side in the upper table, we see the digestibility coefficients of protein, indigestible protein, lipid, and gross energy retention. And then in the table below, we see the apparent protein digestibility and amino acid availability of these test diets. And so all of the amino acids here for essential and non-essential are shown. And then he kind of summarizes down here at the bottom that actually looking at it at the 50% soybean level, he's actually reporting a better overall digestibility of amino acids, essential amino acids in the soy compared with the fish meal diet. And also non-essential is the same. And noting that, except for the full-fat soy at the highest level over here, the digestibility of essential amino acids was higher in all of the soy-containing treatments as opposed to the control, which had 0 soy and it had fish meal. Let's look now at feeding full-fat soybean meal to catfish. So here, everything we see at the beginning here, we have studies from America, we have from Egypt again, and then we have a study from Nigeria. So the study in Egypt and the study in Nigeria are with African catfish, so that's Clarias gariopenus. And then the study by Newton et al. Here at the top is channel catfish. So there were 2 strains. So we had, in this case, the fish were growing from 28 grams initial weight to 422 grams in the control. That's the high fish meal diet. Now we'll take a few minutes to talk about feeding full-fat soybean meal to catfish. The first line here is channel catfish, 2 different strains, and this is by Newton et al. The catfish were fed either a commercial trout feed or they were fed a laboratory feed, semi-practical, with full-fat soybean meal included at 50% of the diet. The feeding trial was 120 days. So here you see when we're talking about they grew from 28 grams to 422 grams, that was in the commercial control. And then when they had the 50% full-fat soy, they had a growth of 340 grams. And then in the other strain, and I'm not giving you the details about the strains, but we have more information coming up. Then once again, the commercial trout feed gave a better result than the laboratory feed. So I'm not necessarily saying that the commercial feed is better, but it might have, let's say, a more complicated formula and maybe better, um, a, a better nutritionist. It's kind of hard to say. In any case, they concluded that the trout feed was much better. And of course, we don't know any details about the trout feed because it was a commercial closed formula. And then we have then the studies with the African catfish, 84 days experiment growing from 7.8 grams to uh, different levels, sizes based on the inclusion rate of fish meal and full fat soy, which went from 0 to 57%. This is basically the same diets that Abdul Warith was using for the carp in the earlier table. So we have then commercial or his control feed with 43% fish meal, and then fish meal down to 23, 16, and 16, and then 16% fish meal with methionine. As I mentioned, the same diets that they used with the carp. And then he concluded that poor growth at 57% full fat soybean meal, um, and he's recommending 20 grams of full fat soy per 100 grams of protein. So he's giving us an idea that the amount of soy that he believes was quite low, basically the lowest level here. And then in the final experiment coming from Nigeria, 65 is the starting weight, and then the final weights of the different treatments. So the final weight's 80.1 was the control, and it went very, very similar for all of the treatments. So fish meal went down, or in this case, fish meal was consistent, but they were replacing peanut meal or groundnut meal. So the full fat soy at 11.16, 22.3, 33.5, and 44.6. The thing with peanut meal is depending on how it's processed, it can also have quite a high fat content, unless it's been had the peanut cake, which has had the peanut oil extracted. And then over here, they're reporting that the cooked soybean meal at the highest level was not significantly different to the peanut meal. Now, whether there was a availability issue, which there might be or might not be, peanut meal, I'm assuming, would be locally available. But it might be inconsistent supply. It might be maybe more expensive than a soybean meal being imported that might have been subsidized by the exporting country. So there's that. Here's the QR codes if you want to go and find those papers. I did show you that the Newton paper, the first one with the channel catfish. So this then is what he's reporting. This is his abstract. So he had a diet where the full-fat soy was 50% of the ration. The soy had been heated to 170 degrees, and he compared it to a commercial trout feed. And then if we go down to the bottom, he says that the commercial feed was better, but then he says the catfish fed the trout ration had significantly lower amounts of body fat. The commercial trout chow overall was significantly better for fish production than the full-fat soybean ration. Production with trout chow was 84% greater than with the full-fat soy. Feed conversion rate efficiency was nearly 41% better with the trout feed, and percent body fat was 11% less. There were no differences in survival and dress out weight And so then he's talking about the catfish that he was using. The trout ration had the lowest production cost. So that's basically a quick summary of that study. Going now to another species, full-fat soybean meal fed to rainbow trout. Here we have 4 studies coming from the United Kingdom, from Germany, from uh, Norway, and then also from Turkey. So we have the body weight you can see there, the feeding trials ranging from 83 to 108 days. They're got different goals. So these people are replacing full fat soy from 0 to 32. As they do that, they're replacing fish meal from 35 down to 17 down to 10. So, and they did add some methionine. And then they said the highest weight gain not significantly different compared to fish meal. So even at the lowest fish meal level, they still found that the soy was quite okay as a feed ingredient. But rainbow trout are known to be, among all of the salmonids, to be the most adaptable to vegetable feed ingredients. We have then this next study, 83 days. The fish weight gains 4 to 5 times body weight. Full fat inclusion, full fat soybean meal inclusion from 0 to 50, and you can see fish meal was reduced as the soy went in. Fish meal reduced from 30 to 20 to 10 to 0. And they did add lysine in the diets with the 2 lowest fish meal levels. And they added methionine to all of the diets that contained soybean. And their recommendation was optimum full fat soy less or than or equal to 20%. You know that they had one treatment here at 20%. And then in this study from Norway, the 108 days, but they grew the fish from 70 grams to 215 grams. So that's a 3-fold increase. They were replacing fish meal, and you see the full fat soy inclusion levels. The fish meal, even in the highest level of full fat soy, the diet still contained 21% fish meal in it, and methionine was added. And then they say the full fat soy was inferior to soybean meal 50. Looking down at the final paper here, fish were grown from about 50 grams to over 200 grams in 84 days. They had 2 levels of soybean meal at 15 and full fat soy at 0, and soybean meal at 7 and full fat soy at 63. Replacing fish meal, the fish meal was reduced from 35% down to 15%. So even the diets containing the high full fat soy still had some fish meal in them. No lysine added, some methionine was added. And then they mentioned that the highest level, or in other words, the 63% full fat soy, was not significantly different than the low, but it was quite a bit cheaper. So that meant that would be an incentive to use soy instead, full fat soy instead of soybean meal. Here are the places where you can find those papers. This one here by Beckman, hydrothermically treated full fat soybeans in rainbow trout. It's in a large book of workshop proceedings, recent advances of research in anti-nutritional factors in legume seeds. But if you download that, you go and find page 133, and that's where their report starts. We just take a minute now and look at the last of those papers by the researchers from Turkey, the effects of feeds containing high and low levels of full-fat soybean on the growth performance and production cost of rainbow trout. So they were interested in replacing both fish meal and also using full-fat soybean meal instead of conventional soybean meal. Looking at the diets, then we see fish meal in the low full-fat soy, 35% fish meal, 15% soybean meal. And in the high full-fat soy, then we have fish meal reduced from 35 down to 15, soybean meal reduced from 15 to 7. But in this diet, then they have 63% of the diet is full-fat soybean meal. And down below, we see the analysis for those diets. In the center, then here we see the impact on the body analysis. So basically, we're not seeing much differences at all. A little bit in protein in terms of the final total body, and a minor difference, but not significant in terms of crude protein in the final carcass. But the biggest differences we see is that there are some significant differences in fat, which we would kind of expect because the full fat soy, if we're looking over here, we see that this diet had only 12.4% fat, where this one had nearly 17. So that is going to have some effect on the amount of fat in the tissue, also have some effect maybe on visceral fat collected in the body cavity. Then if we move over to the final column where we're looking at the growth performance of fish fed these two diets, initial weight about 50 grams, and the high full-fat soy slightly higher, but not significantly higher. We see the feed conversion ratios, protein efficiency ratio, protein productive value, SGR, condition factor, survival, and then we have complete feed price and feed production costs. So looking at that, I don't know what the units are here, but they're talking about the high soy full-fat soy diet is looks like it's around 25% cheaper than the low full-fat soy diet in terms of replacing both fish meal and also regular soybean meal. Here now is a short report on the paper from Norway on the nutritive value of 4 soybean products. So we can see that the products were full-fat soybean meal 44, soybean meal 50, and then also soybean protein concentrate. And you can see the formulations here. So fish meal at 50, fish meal at 50. The difference here is that one has a high fish oil and low soy oil or zero soybean oil. And the other one then has low fish oil and a high soybean oil. So I think they're trying to see what's happening between the high fat, full fat soy and the other diets with the low fat level of the extracted soybean meal. Case they also added methionine across here. So noting here that on this, all three of these graphs have the same axis. So soybean protein as a percent of total protein in the diet. That basically corresponds with their different treatments, as you can see. In this case, if we look at the code here, we see that the best performance in terms of weight gain was with the soy protein concentrate. And the poorest performance was with the full-fat soybean meal in terms of weight gain. But then they're also looking at excretion. In this case, then they have the highest fecal dry matter content. So high fecal dry matter means low organic loss. Protein concentrate is giving us the best result there. And then if we look at fecal lipid excretion, so this then is looking particularly at the are the lipids digestible or not. Here we can see that the soy protein concentrate, very low lipid excretion, while soy protein concentrate has a very low fat content anyway. The next one here is the full-fat soybean meal. So it also had a fairly low lipid excretion, meaning that the lipid content of the soy is quite biologically available. And the diet that seemed to be the worst was the soybean meal 44 up here. This is the soybean meal 50 here. Now I'm going to talk about salmon in this beginning here with Pacific salmon, and then I'll finish off with Atlantic salmon. This is research conducted by Lori Fowler, who was a biologist and nutritionist working with the Oregon Department of Fisheries. He was involved in feed development and feed research for the salmon hatcheries that were releasing fish into the Columbia River and so on. There's another slide coming after this. I will show you the diets. So we'll just mention briefly that the full-fat soybean meal he used was heated to those 4 different temperatures using a process developed by a company called CPM, California Pellet Mill. Basically, they heated the soybeans, not dehulled, and for about 1 minute. And due to their native moisture, they become quite hot, are under pressure. And then they put them through a roller mill and they kind of explode. But they've been cooked during that 1 minute of heating. And then he take each one of these heat treatment levels and created a diet with them. Here you see his initial body weights. The fish are quite small. The Chinook are 1.5 grams, and in another trial, 6.9 grams. And the coho were very small, 0.9 grams. He's using the full-fat soy to replace fish meal. And as fish meal is going down from 37% down to 15%, full-fat soy is increasing from 0 to 48.9. He did add some methionine. The next slide will show you his diets and the outcome of his experiments. Now here we can see his diet. So he has reported here diets 1 to 26. He also had another diet provided to him, an experimental diet provided to him for rainbow trout by Robert Smith in Idaho. That diet he's not showing because he said that the Chinook salmon absolutely refused to eat it and they all died. I will be talking about that more in my upcoming video where I go into my PhD research I go through some of the details about my dissertation, which is the next video I intend to record. Okay, getting back to this, we see that he had a control with 30%, 37% herring meal, and the herring meal levels decreased. Then he had some cottonseed meal here and full-fat soy in those 3 diets, or those diets 2 to 5, 6 to 9, and 10 to 13, based on these cooking levels. Then he had another series of diets with standard soybean meal, 48% protein here. And you can see the rest of the ingredients. Some added methionine, but no added lysine. And then we're looking at all of these diets here with the full-fat soy. I'm not showing you with the normal soybean meal. The heat treatment does have an impact on the final body weight, as you can see here. It did have some impact on mortality. And as I mentioned, he decided that full-fat soy was not an ingredient that should be fed to Chinook salmon. So just very briefly, I will bring up my PhD dissertation. It was entitled Full-Fat Soybean Meal, an Acceptable Economical Ingredient in Chinook Salmon Grower Feeds. I've just got a few slides here. This is the cover page, University of Washington School of Fisheries. Down at the bottom here, I note that my PhD research was sponsored by EWAS Canada with their factory in Surrey, BC, Canada. And my commercial scale trial, or in a commercial R&D farm, was located off Denman Island in British Columbia. Here, this is the write-up by the committee. Thomas Roy Wilson has conducted a carefully designed and very extensive large-scale study on incorporation of full-fat soybean meal into Chinook salmon feeds, and has demonstrated conclusively that this component, when properly processed, that's very important, when properly processed, can be included to at least 18% of the diet formula without any detectable nutritional deficiencies in salmon reared from 500 grams to 1,000 grams in weight. Okay, this is the first positive demonstration that this component can be used for Chinook salmon feeds, and I go into a lot more detail about the problems people were having feeding soy and even certainly full-fat soy to salmon in my upcoming video. Moving on now to Atlantic salmon. A couple of experiments here. Both of them are coming from Norway. In this case, Atlantic salmon, 560 grams up to 2.5 kilos or more. Actually, both of these researchers are in the same laboratory and they work together. So the diets are basically the same. So they're doing different work. One is looking at fat, then they're looking at different things. So this one is to reduce fish meal, and this one is to reduce 10% of fish meal protein. So here you can see that the medium fat and high fat both are the same. Fish meal 55.6% down to 46. This one 55.6, or in other words, the same diet as that one. But the high fat has come down a little bit more, down to 40.9% fish meal. They're reporting that the high fat diet caused high lipid gain adiposity. No impact from the full fat soy on the flavor up there. And in this case, once again, just reporting that the high fat diets caused high lipid gain. There's the QR codes if you want to find those. And just as I end here, full fat soy for other fish species, we have some research here with halibut, Atlantic cod, sablefish, and Siberian sturgeon. In terms of the halibut, up to 36% full-fat soybean meal can be used in the feeds. But with Atlantic cod, so full-fat soy reduced the specific growth rate, and small fish seem to be affected more than larger fish. They grew the fish 6 weeks, and then they analyzed the growth and so on. And then they let them grow for another 6 weeks, and then they noted that the larger fish had a better performance on the same feeds. In terms of the sablefish, the high full-fat soy was not different than soy protein concentrate. And that's an interesting result from this researcher in the United States. And then finally here, this study looking at Siberian sturgeon. They had different levels of full-fat soy with 3 different dietary treatments. The difference between the AT1, the AT2, and AT3 was that the AT1 had no supplemented lysine and methionine, and then the AT2 and AT3 had supplemental lysine and methionine. Then they report that the AT1 and the AM1 is the diet with the added supplements, where the AT1 is the one without the supplements, performed better than the others. So here are the places where you can go and find those papers. So this is really just about all of the species that have been done with using full-fat soy. Now let's move on to feeding full-fat soybean meal to shrimp. First of all, let's look at Penaeus shrimp, and in this case, all of the research I can find is right there. That's basically it, relating specifically to full-fat soybean meal. And I mentioned earlier that due to the high fat content and the fact that most shrimp feeds are relatively low in fat, and also if you're making feeds with pellet mills, that restricts your fat content of your feed even more, that there's not that much interest in using full-fat soybean meal as an ingredient in shrimp feed. What there is here is for Penaeus vannamei. There is nothing at all on Penaeus monodon that I could find searching here in the beginning of 2026 with Google Scholar. So you can see that full-fat soybean meal, according to Lumen Domini, from this 1992 paper, was more or less equivalent to adding soybean meal plus soybean oil. And you can see the levels at which they tested in the diets. They went up to 35% inclusion. And these feeds, note that were double dry extruded. So that is not pellet mill, and they would be able to tolerate higher fat levels than maybe a pellet mill could. Here's the QR code for that paper. It's behind a paywall. So if you have institutional access, you can get access to that. Now let's talk about feeding full-fat soybean meal to freshwater prawn here, and we're talking about Macrobrachium rosenbergii. And once again, up to January 2026, I can only find 2 papers that are online relating to feeding fresh full-fat soybean meal to freshwater prawn. The first one by Chileran Teprasit is a master's thesis from the University of Manitoba in Canada. I'll show you the information in a minute. And he was able to use up to 42% full-fat soybean meal in feeds for Macrobrachium. You can see the detail there, his inclusion levels 0, 7, 14, and 21% in one experiment. And then because he didn't see any benefit at having it too low, he then tried a second experiment where he increased the levels to 14, 28, and 42%. And then you can see that he did add some lysine, he did add some methionine to some of his treatments. And then we have this experiment coming from India where these researchers were growing freshwater prawn alone or freshwater prawn together with 2 species of Indian major carps, Catla catla and Labio rojita. And you see here then he has the freshwater prawn only result, one experiment, the Indian major carps only, and then combined together in a kind of a polyculture. And then he says that the freshwater prawn growth was slightly better with D1, but the standard deviation was not different than D2. So what's the difference between D1 and D2? Is the concentration of full-fat soybean meal, 25% in D1 and 37.5 in D2. So even at this higher level of 37.5%, the results were not significantly different than the lower level of 25. And here's the QR codes to gain access to both of these papers. Resources. Full-fat soybean meal as an alternative feed ingredient. So we have this paper, I believe I mentioned it in one of my previous videos, full-fat soy oils and fats in poultry nutrition. Irregardless of the fact it's for poultry, all of the information relative to the characteristics and qualities and nutritional value of the ingredients is the same. The only thing that really makes a difference is if there's stuff relating to digestibility. Well, of course, the poultry isn't very relevant to us. Then another paper relating once again to poultry, full-fat soybean meals as an alternative poultry feed ingredient, feed processing methods, and utilization review and perspective. So they're looking at the feed processing methods and how that impacts differences in the performance of full-fat soy in poultry feeds. The one paper that is definitely worth looking at is this one, full-fat soybean meal utilization by fish. And this is really a review, even though it's 1992. As you can see, I am looking up at the beginning of 2026 in Google Scholar and not finding anything new to speak of. So that tells us that even though this is quite old now, the information is still very relevant. It lists all the papers that have been published for many of the fish species that I've been talking about here in this video. and also mentions briefly about crustaceans. So that's the end of my video. You can find me here on YouTube, of course. You can find me on X as Fish Nutrition Expert. You can find me on LinkedIn as Thomas Wilson, Fish Nutrition Expert. And I do have an intention of doing podcasts, although I have not done that yet. Please subscribe to my channel. It helps me to reach a larger audience. Like my videos, make comments, tell me what you'd like to see more of, and I can certainly pay attention to that and release more videos. Turn on notifications so you can get more videos from me, and share, particularly if you are involved in any kind of activity around a university. Share it with your fellow students and so on, because that's really my main intention with this information, is to provide this information to people in countries that don't have easy access to good university educations relating to fish nutrition. So thank you very much.